Hi, everyone. I'm Karina. I'm going to be talking about farmland investment as a vehicle for environmental conservation and specifically looking at sort of the social equity implications. So in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl in the US turned healthy soils across the Great Plains to dust. Today, farms are losing twice as much topsoil to erosion every year as the Great Plains lost in a typical year at the height of the Dust Bowl. So this is happening because US agriculture, as it's currently practiced on a large scale, is depleting our soils at an unsustainable rate. It's critical that we rebuild the health of our soils so they can retain more water, sequester more carbon, support more biodiversity, among a number of other benefits. We have the conservation techniques that farmers can use to do so, but these practices have not been widely adopted. So why is that? Well, farmland in the US is primarily privately owned. So the stewards of our soil have to respond to a variety of market pressures, often at the expense of the long-term health and preservation of the soil. There is also an increasing trend in farmland investment. It is often for the purpose of diversifying investor portfolios, making money off appreciating land values, which can have negative impacts on not only the environment, but also farmers and their communities. So my research question is looking to see if there's an opportunity to create an equitable farmland investment model that leverages private capital to instead protect farmland and increase soil health, producing both environmental and social benefits. My client is an investor and entrepreneur who's working with the Berkeley Food Institute to explore this question. There are 3 of us graduate students working on different aspects of this project, and what I'm talking about today represents a sliver of everything we've been working on. As for our methods, we conducted a lot of research and upwards of 40 interviews with farmers, landowners, government officials, academics, farmland investment companies, nonprofits, the list goes on. And perhaps not surprisingly, they have left me with more questions than answers. But here are a few things that I wanted to highlight about the current system. So land access and secure land tenure are generally the biggest barrier to preventing the adoption of more sustainable practices in agriculture. This is partly because making that transition can take several years, and farmers often can't afford to wait that long to show a positive cash flow because their operations are usually driven by annual financial pressures like bank loans and land leases. Also, land values have been increasing over the past 30 years. And so often the only way for farmers to be able to purchase land today is through a lot of debt. So let's see, are you seeing my next slide? Yes. So what does that mean about who owns farmland? Well, 40% is rented, it's a lot. And of that, 80% is owned by absentee landlords, who are largely not incentivized to encourage their tenants to implement conservation practices on their land. Nearly 70% of farmland is owned by people over 65 years old, and 98% of landowners in the US are white. So putting more land into the hands of investors has serious equity implications, given especially the history of land dispossession and discrimination against farmers of color in the US. So there is concern that any form of farmland investment is going to exacerbate existing inequalities in land ownership. But I would argue the current system continues to create these inequalities, and it's enabling investors to buy up farmland left and right with no consideration for negative impacts. So until we can change the system's political underpinnings, and given the current lay of the land, could farmland be owned by an entity that's designed to protect the land and to lower barriers of land access to a more diverse farmer population? So let's look what a farmland investment model would actually look like. All right. This is a very simplified version, but it's based on a private equity model. And we're considering some version of the following. Land is purchased, or it could be donated and put into a trust. It's owned by investors. The land is rented to farmers with long-term leases that require the use of conservation practices. Investors would possibly receive a government incentive, like a tax credit, to encourage investment in this model, which could potentially have lower than market rate returns. The investors are going to provide capital needed for startup costs and infrastructure improvements, super important things that farmers need to be able to invest in the land long term. And then have the ability, the farmers, to have the ability to build equity in the fund itself. So one idea in particular that we're exploring, which is up in the top left, is this idea, a public-private partnership model, where a nonprofit would actually be the manager and possibly owner of a fund like this, which builds an accountability mechanism into the structure. So there are already NGOs that have diverse farmer networks, which could be included in the creation and management of a fund. And more research definitely needs to be done into the feasibility of this, especially on the legal side. But this is an intriguing option to me because it begins to address a tension that I have been grappling with between scale and equity. So scale is achieved through mechanisms of the dominant system or the dominant culture, and therefore it tends to be homogenizing, meaning how do we impact the most possible acres of farmland without ending up working with a bunch of old white farmers, for lack of a better term. So with this model, the private equity enables greater impact, but it puts nonprofits, which can be governed by more diverse voices, in the driver's seat. I'm also recommending targeting farmers who do not already have land equity and trying to acquire land for this fund from absentee landowners. I'm suggesting some parameters. So regardless of what type of model we might be looking at, and I'm suggesting that there should be guidelines around the following: designing an equitable entity structure that prevents a power imbalance that will favor investors over farmers, including farmers in both the design and decision-making processes, defining and sharing risk, prioritizing values. This could entail departure from the classic shareholder value model, establishing accountability mechanisms, both internal and external, regulating land selection, so restricting from buying land that has scarce resources, say water, which could have negative effects on surrounding communities, and then a flexible framework for measuring ecosystem benefits, which I don't have time to go into now. So ultimately, if we really want to create more equity, the greatest levers for change lie at deeper levels of this very complex system, which the government has the power to pull. But the clock is ticking against climate change and the loss of farmland to soil erosion. So I think it's worth imagining new roles for private capital until we see the political will necessary to make some more systemic changes. So hopefully my research will provide some insights and guidelines for folks working on climate smart agriculture in both the private and public sectors. And I will stop there.
Who are the absentee, can I ask you, who are the absentee landlord in the United States?
Who are they?
Yes.
So there is a big survey that was done by the American Farmland Trust in 2020. So we have more information on them than we've had in the past. Mm-hmm. They're also called non-operator landlords. So it's anyone who's not actually operating their land. Mm-hmm. It's reflective of the larger representation of who owns farmland, meaning older and white. However, there's some really interesting research coming out about women landowners, and it's a very under-researched piece because they actually, I think, of non-operator landlords, they comprise like 40%. So there's some really interesting work in that space happening. That's the simplest answer to your question, I think.
Oh, because the answer is that because people leave the farm, the reason that old people stay in the farm because young people don't want to stay in the farm. And a lot of times the people that own the land are widows and the older people that basically move to city and are so these are some of the issues that the detail are really important. The other thing, what do you think about the conservation reserve program and no tillage? No, because
go ahead.
No, because I think what happened is that no tillage made a big difference. The conservation reserve program makes some difference. It would be much bigger. But knowledge of this thing is really important because they're really crucial to understand what's going on in the farm sector.
Yeah. So I'm going to start actually by responding to the comment about age. I've discovered some really interesting pieces to this. So what's often referred to as like our aging farmer problem, you know, as if farmers weren't supposed to age. No, I'm kidding. But so there are multiple things going on. One of which is just the mechanization of farming, especially on a large scale. It just enables people to work longer. Like you said, there's also less interest in getting into it because it's more and more challenging to make a profit farming, especially if you're just starting out. Additionally, this is a really interesting piece. If you think about the tax code, so the tax incentives right now disincentivize you from transferring your land in your lifetime because there are huge capital gains taxes. So lawyers left and right are advising their clients, no, hang on to your land until you die. So there's just some interesting pieces to that. On the tillage, the no-till and conservation programs, something I'll say, the government conservation programs, there are many, there are a number, and many of them are really trying to do a lot of really good work, but often they, new beginning and farmers of color are disadvantaged to receiving the benefits from those programs because it often requires land ownership. So what happens is they do tend to go to the larger farms in terms of acreage, but also, so there's limited reach from those programs. And in conjunction with other government support, such as crop insurance, for example, or subsidies that are really pushing towards other practices that are counterproductive, I would argue, for some of these conservation efforts. It's a complicated kind of mix there.
I think it's a great topic, but it should really break it down. There is the equity issue, there is the soil erosion issue, and there is a terrible policies like crop insurance. If you break it down, you will be in much better shape than trying to cover everything.
Yeah, yes, and I can just say in the chat quickly, Agrarian Trust, we spoke to Farmland is Farmland is doing something really interesting in California. One of the big pieces that I've identified is a kind of a gap in this whole equation is around succession planning and estate planning. There's not a lot of conversation happening around conservation with all of these aging landowners who are starting to think about what to do with their land. So I see this actually as a huge opportunity. And Farmland is doing a lot around how to structure leases and succession planning. Sorry, George, do you want to?
Yeah, just a lot of suggestions of resources to look at. Agrarian Trust, there's an EDF report, evidently Glenn is pointing out. Tia Christopher, you saw that Farmland. So yeah, no, I guess this is a very vibrant topic of conversation. Where do you see your project with you and your colleagues working with the Berkeley Food Institute? What is so you're particularly working with this one investor, and is it their intention to set up an investment trust like this as a? I mean, where will they be taking this?
Yeah, so the original model we were supposed to be evaluating is actually modeled after a REIT, a real estate investment trust. And we sort of came to the conclusion that, especially from an equity point of view, that's probably not a model anyone feels comfortable recommending. So the idea was, if we could come up with a model that we do want to try to structure a pilot off of, that would be the next step. And part of the reason why I mentioned the government incentive piece is that in order to get that to actually manifest, a lot would have to happen. And so the idea is, if through philanthropic funding, we can actually see a pilot out over a couple of years and use that as also a place for academic research, et cetera, to kind of a proof in point, we will have a much easier time trying to create something like a government incentive that would help to catalyze this on a larger scale. So I would say a pilot, if we get to that point, would be the next step. And otherwise, just, farmland investment is this, there's more and more interest in it across the country and the world. But so if this research can work to inform that, that's a great next step as well.
Speak with people from the Nature Conservancy. Yeah,
they're also doing interesting stuff around leases and this kind of tenant landlord misaligned incentives piece. They are also doing some interesting work on.
All right, other questions? I think one of the as you talk about philanthropic funds. I just wonder if the combined, I mean, David's earlier comment of kind of breaking it down, I mean, is it more about the soils? Is it more about the relationships? Is it more about the equity? And would it be better to take one of those approaches towards getting this going, or the blended approach, kind of equity and I don't know. I mean, I just wonder that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. One of the different farmland investment models that are actually interested in trying to have environmental outcomes. There's a clear difference between the ones that select land first versus select farmers first.
Right.
So, and again, this is kind of this scale versus equity issue that I have been grappling with. So I think that one of the reasons why I'm intrigued by this idea of working with like a nonprofit that has kind of a network already, and has kind of some principles and practices and accountability around the way they prioritize farmers in their model, is a kind of an interesting way of maybe bridging those two. But you're getting at exactly it. You know, we care about the soil because we care about the environment, because we care about the people in the environment. But if you start with the soil and only focus on the soil, then you know you have to be careful what the implications are on the social side.
Well, no one said that sustainable development practice is easy. So